Right, it's 12:02 now. We've got a good number of people have come in. I'm sure there'll be more joining us in due course, but we'll kickstart the session. I'll just begin by introducing myself. I'm Paul Griffiths. I work within the Welsh Government, the Commercial Procurement Division, and I've got specific responsibility for overseeing a programme of collaborative activity that sits within the Wales Collaborative Procurement Pipeline. So the session for me today around the applying the sustainable risk assessment throughout your procurement activity is something that is highly relevant. And I know it's a session I'm really looking forward to for getting the very latest information from my colleague Brendan. I will introduce Brendan in a moment, but before we do that, if we can go on to the next slide, Brendan. And it's just to note that this is part of the Lunch and Learn series that we're running from the Commercial Procurement Capability team. We have a real sort of theme around net zero, although I would say that today is going a little bit beyond that, and we're into the realm of greater sustainability, but obviously with a focus on net zero throughout that. Our first session was a week or so ago, where we drew in representation from a number of organisations. So we had Welsh Government, NRW, WLGA, Welsh Government Energy Service, talking about the work that they're doing to support net zero. And for those who think, oh, we should see that, I've missed out on a good one there. Fear not, it's available on the Keyed website. So the recording is there, available for everyone to go back to and watch there. In addition to today then, which will also be recorded and made available on the Keyed website, we've got a number of sessions coming up over the following weeks. So we have got our carbon reduction reporting session with colleagues from Crown Commercial Services. They'll be joining us on the 28th of June. And then on the 5th of July, because the first three sessions have all been about what we can do on the procurement side, we're going to be hearing from a company called Lyrico, who supply under one of the national collaborative agreements that I oversee within my particular area. And we'll be hearing about what you can do or how you can get your suppliers and what they can do to really deliver the wider sustainability agenda and, of course, supporting net zero. So before I hand over to Brendan, I think the next slide, Brendan, is around housekeeping, isn't it? So just can I ask that everybody mutes themselves during the presentations? Now we've got there, please raise a hand to ask a question. During Brendan's presentation, can I ask that we don't raise any hands, but we just literally post our questions in the chat bar? That's just to ensure that the well-practiced flow that Brendan has is not interrupted, but I'll be keeping an eye on every question as they come in. We'll make sure we pick those up at the end. And at the end, of course, if we do have time for hands to be raised, we'd be delighted to go through that particular process. As I mentioned briefly at the outset, we're recording this particular session. And as I've already said, you will see the presentation on the Keyed website in a number of days as well. So I'm just going to introduce our speaker now, and you could argue that Brendan Burke, a colleague I've worked with for many a long year. That's right, isn't it, Brendan? Probably going back to 20 years or so.
Yeah, at least.
Needs no introduction when it comes to sustainable procurement. And if you just very briefly consider Brendan's CV, as it were, of the activity that is accomplished in that 20 years for the Welsh Government, it does read like a litany of sustainable procurement best practice. So in addition to the work that Brendan's going to be describing around the sustainable risk assessment, which is something that Brendan himself developed going back quite a number of years ago and has kept live, current, and very much at the forefront of helping us deliver sustainability. Brendan was also the lead behind the development of the former Sustainable Procurement Assessment Framework, which was a tool that I used going back probably about 15 years ago, Brendan. It was absolutely superb. That has now evolved into, and Brendan has assisted our colleagues in RAP in the development of the Sustainable Procurement Maturity Review, which a number on this call have undoubtedly been through alongside RAP, and they're specialists in that particular area. Not content with all of that, Brendan is very much our key author in terms of some really important Wales procurement policy notes that I know we all rest upon in terms of how we deliver wider sustainability. So we've heard a lot from Brendan around net zero, of course, and his policy note there about how we approach that through procurement lens, I know is something that's been used and valued by the majority, if not all, of the Welsh public sector. lest we forget that Brendan's guidance note on social value a number of years ago has really just helped expand the use and that approach, and just given us the confidence to try new things in that particular space. Something that I've used extensively of Brendan's authoring was the reserving contracts with the public mission, another Welsh procurement policy note, which is just a quite brilliant guide. And of late, and Brendan doesn't know this, I've actually been sharing it with colleagues in England, because it is just a superb step-by-step guide for engaging social enterprises in your procurement activity. And lest we forget some of the earlier work Brendan was involved in around removing barriers to SME engagement, the Opening Doors Charter, which I think was a brilliant piece of work, Brendan. Brendan's evolved that more recently into a more current Wales procurement policy note, again, which is something that we draw upon. He's done a whole lot more than that, of course. He is also known as Mr. Project Bank Accounts. So Brendan has been leading the application and support for project bank accounts for more years than I could possibly remember, Brendan. That's probably another 20. And he did tremendous work in terms of community benefits. You know, the world has sort of evolved into the realms of wider social value now, but there was some great work done, and it's still delivering the community benefits policy and methodology. And I know Brendan was instrumental in helping that evolve and deliver over many a long year. So it's an impressive sustainable procurement resume, to put it mildly, Brendan. So without any more ado, we'd be delighted to share in your knowledge around the Sustainable Procurement Risk Assessment tool. So I'll hand over to Brendan, and you'll hear from me a little bit later on towards the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Pnawn everybody. I'm a bit exhausted after that run through there, Paul. I'm glad I'm not touching on some of those things again today, but what we'll do, it's billed as looking at the Sustainable Risk Assessment. I won't actually show you, we won't go into the actual tool itself today, but I'll give you a flavour of it. This is just an introduction. As Paul said, this is just a lunch and learn. So it's kind of a quick skip through. I'm not assuming any prior knowledge here, so I'm just going to run through you know, a few kind of key points really that we've got in there. So we look at the why, the what, and the where and the how. So in terms of why, we're thinking about you know, why are we doing this? What's it all about? Why do we need to focus on sustainable procurement in particular? What's the role of procurement in there? So we'll look at, you know, definitions of sustainable development and sustainable procurement as they apply in Wales, and some of the basics. You know, there's 3 key pieces of legislation really. So the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, Environment Wales Act, and most recently, and most importantly, I think, the Social Partnerships and Public Procurement Act. It was only passed into law earlier this month, I believe, and that's got something important in there that I'll share with you. Then in terms of the detail of what we're trying to talk about today, so we're looking at, you know, in terms of doing a sustainability risk assessment, what's it based on? So it's based on a life cycle thinking approach, and then I'll describe, you know, where it fits into the procurement cycle. So it's key. It's not just at the early stage. It plays some key roles throughout, and then we'll actually look at the SRA itself. So I'll run through how ideally it should be used. I think it's probably the best way to put that. So just starting off really, as we're all very aware, there's only one planet. There's no planet B. We've got one planet, one load of resources at our disposal, and sustainable development is kind of classically built up around three pillars of sustainability. So you have environmental capital, so your environmental resources. You've got your social capital and your economic capital, and clearly there from the pyramid structure, if we undermine the environmental, then the rest of it topples over. So we only get social capital interaction and social structures while we've got a sound environment and all the goods and services that we need from that, and then the economic builds off all of that. So it's only when we've got sound environmental base, and we've got using resources well and not undermining our own futures, that we can develop the economic systems that we need to thrive and prosper. So as I mentioned, we've got 3 key pieces of legislation that really govern what we're trying to do, what we need to do through procurement. So the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, the Environment Act 2016, and it was amended in 2021. And the amendment in 2021 was simply to move us from an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050 to a full commitment to a net zero by 2050, so 100% reduction on the base year of, well, it's a different base year depending on which scopes we're looking at, but it's the early 90s, I believe. And the Social Partnerships and Public Procurement Act, which passed very recently. So looking at the Sustainable Development Principle that's built into forms the first part of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And that principle says that bodies subject to the Act, and I would suggest that we should all be working in this way if you're not listed as part of a body that's subject to the Act. We're expected to act in a manner that seeks to ensure that the needs of the present are met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, which is kind of a long version, a long way of saying if we undermine the environmental capital and the other social structures we've got, then in terms of what we leave for future generations is going to be much diminished, and they're going to struggle to meet their needs if we use all the resources now or ruin the environment. And climate ecosystem resources are included in that environmental definition. So then looking at the Social Partnerships and Public Procurement Act, many of you may not have had a chance to look at this in any detail, but within Chapter 2, you've got this social responsible procurement duty. So as you can see there, the two clauses. A contracting authority has got to seek to improve economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being. So that reflects back to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. There's 4 aspects of sustainability. And then in order to do that, so what does that mean? It says you must act in a socially responsible way. What does that mean in terms of procurement? So it's by taking action in accordance with the Sustainable Development Principle, which I mentioned before. And that then is going to have a focus on that sustainability pyramid and making sure that we use resources wisely and develop in a way that doesn't compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs and make adjustments to correct some of the damage I think we've done along the way. Just something, again, I'm mentioning that there's, quite obviously there's only one planet, no planet B. Where are we in terms of the resource use? So our resource use currently, there are a couple of things. There's an Earth Overshoot Day, which I believe for last year was 28th of July. So by the 28th of July last year, as the globally, we'd used up all the resources for that given year. And within that, there's a breakdown. There's a country overshoot days. So what I've highlighted there for you is that we've got the UK. We passed our personal overshoot day on the 19th of May. So that's if every country in the world lived as we do, all the resources would have been used up by the 19th of May. So it's quite a stark reminder that we need to be being a bit better, a bit more focused on how we use resources and focus on renewable resources and a more circular economy to make sure we're as resource efficient as we can possibly be. And then just final happy little thought for you. As we've seen, there's the final one on the climate crisis, act now or it's too late. And we've got a key role to play in terms of procurement, and I'll explain a little bit more how we fit into there and the importance of us making the right decisions in the decisions we make when we're planning for our procurements. So again, this is focusing on a carbon footprint, but it's the point here is that when you look at the carbon footprint of an organisation, in all cases, the largest element is the purchase of goods and services. So that things that happen in our supply chain and how we manage that. So I've got 3 examples there for you. So we've got NHS Wales, NRW. So NRW assessed the carbon footprint in 2017 and found that 59% was in the purchased goods and services. NHS 62%, and Welsh Government, which is a more recent one than both of those for 2020-21. Welsh Government, our carbon footprint for supply chain emissions, which is essentially our purchased goods and services, was 88% of our overall footprint. So how we buy those and what we buy is really critical to driving that down and getting a better handle and control on it. So it might be useful then just to go into what's the definition of sustainable procurement as opposed to procurement defined in other ways. So again, you see, it keeps coming back to the same themes of economic, social, and environmental and cultural well-being. And when you phrase it in terms of an organisation's approach, it's about meeting the organisation's needs without compromising the needs of future generations, and doing it in a way that achieves value for money. And there should be no conflict between a sustainable approach and achieving value for money, because a lot of the things we'll be asking of suppliers will go to their bottom line. It'll be, reducing their costs and their overheads by getting them to do things in a more efficient and effective way wherever we possibly can. So that kind of brings us to quite a useful way of thinking about all this. So the sustainable procurement hierarchy, which it follows, is based on the waste hierarchy. So essentially, the first step is always rethink the need, and it says there, no purchase is the best way to go. If you can avoid it altogether, eliminate it. If you've got to commit to a contract for goods or services, then reduce. So use as little as you can. So work with suppliers on what they're providing to us, and reducing the impact of what they do for us and what they provide. Build in reuse options. So ensure that we've got the options to reuse the materials or reuse the products we're buying. So can they be repurposed, reused? The next step then, if they can't be repurposed or reused or sold on, then you can look at recycling options. So within the SRAs, we talk about eco-design principles, and we can specify this stuff, that when we buy things, that we need it to be constructed, if it's a product, in a way that allows it to be disassembled and sent into relevant waste streams, so it goes back into more easily back into remanufacture and reuse, rather than just being jumbled together. And then this should be very narrow at the end: energy recovery and end of life. So energy recovery is essentially incinerating things to create energy out of waste. And then end of life, there may be residuals that we can't do anything about. So it's ensuring that we understand what they're likely to be and manage those in an appropriate way. So I'll bring you to the life cycle thinking approach, which is the next step. And the key point there, I've just mentioned end of life. If you set off, if all you think about is, the whole life cost, the total cost of acquisition of goods and services, then you're going to miss the point in terms of where the raw materials come from. So we need to concern ourselves with that, because if they're coming from unsustainable sources, however good the price might look, ultimately we're undermining that environmental capital. And then if we don't consider what's in the product, we may have an issue at end of life. So you maybe end up with a product or outputs of a service where you've got limited options or expensive options for removal and safe disposal. So in terms of life cycle thinking, this is essentially what we do, and this is what the SRA is based on. So it starts off thinking about raw materials, where are they coming from? There's likely to be environmental damage there, which is probably the biggest point, but there are also other elements within that I'll discuss in a minute. Obviously manufacturing then, so things go away to be manufactured. Where's that being done? How is that being done? Again, are any waste or pollution being generated from that activity? And then transportation, so things have to be moved from A to B. There's two aspects to that. I'll mention that in a second. And then when it comes into use, so we install, we put these things into use within our organisations. If there are key features about the way in which those products should be used, we need to communicate that to our staff so that we don't undermine, perhaps the good work we've done before in specifying the right things and in the right ways if they're not used, or if it's not explained to people how things should be used. And particularly around the point that at the end of the life, there should be a channel for it to go back into reuse or for resale, so they don't get disposed of outside of that loop. Is important to note. We need to obviously consider maintenance of products as we buy things. So this is just from a commercial perspective. So yes, you're buying something. Is it going to be costly to maintain? Is it going to involve a lot of consumables, a lot of parts? If so, are there better options, different ways of doing it? As I mentioned before, then as you get to the disposal stage, the significance of the thin red arrow towards landfill and energy recovery is that should be the absolute residual. when we can't repurpose it, recycle it, or reuse it. So I apologise, this isn't fully translated, but it's something I've used before, and I think is useful. Kind of makes that previous diagram a little bit simpler. So when we're planning through the SRA, we're thinking about, you know, how raw materials are being extracted or harvested. So we've got deforestation, tropical rainforest being cut down for things, minerals being exploited in unsustainable ways. So we need to think about what's going into our products and where it's coming from. So conflict minerals and things like that start to come into that. Then the manufacturing process, where's that going to be? I mentioned transportation. So transportation and people are at each stage here. So people aren't mentioned there because it's assumed that they're intrinsic to the whole process. None of this happens without people being involved. But we need to be alert to potentials for exploitation within that process, and making sure that people are treated fairly throughout. That's our suppliers, as well as particularly when we're accessing global supply chains, making sure there's no modern slavery, and other issues, fair work principles are applied where we can do that. So I mentioned the transportation bit, but focusing there on the packaging and distribution elements. So that is something, I've put that in there because it's something we can absolutely deal with in our procurement. We can specify the packaging and the way in which products and services are delivered. So we can focus in on that because it's our money that's going to pay for that. We obviously need to select suppliers on the basis that they're going to do the right thing and that their supply chains and their activities are correct. So that gives that extension down the supply chain. But in terms of the packaging distribution, can't be underestimated. And hopefully, I'll forget the time, I'll give you some examples of what that means, because it's not a complicated process. I mentioned product use there, and that just gives you that loop back to reuse, resale, repurpose. Then things can't go down those routes. They go off for recycling and then back through to manufacturing, and we develop that virtuous circle of the circular economy. And again, the smallest arrow we can put on there is to send things off for energy recovery. So in terms of where the SRA fits into the procurement cycle, so obviously its key role is in the planning of the procurement, so understanding all the issues and opportunities that may arise. But it then features also as you move into the defining of requirements, the preparation of your tender documents, your advertising. What are you going to say to the market? Early market engagement is key in terms of a lot of the stuff around sustainability. And then how are you going to, what are your evaluation and selection criteria going to be? So the SRA should inform some of that. So it's a reference document. You produce it as part of the documents, the planning of your procurement. Your routes to market and all the rest of it are going to be in there. But it's key. It's essential that you revisit it. It's no good doing it and then leaving it on the shelf. You've got to bring these things forward into the process then. And then the other key part in terms of the contract management element. So a contract startup and throughout contract management, it's important that anything that's been featured in the SRA is as important and needs to be delivered. The conversation should be had. So at the startups contract award stage, the winning bidders, suppliers, contractors, service providers should be informed. This is what we expect of you. It's not just about, if it's a product, delivering the product to the right standard, to the right place, and charging us, the contracted prices. It's more than that. It's doing all the other things. Paul's mentioned working with social enterprises, working with supported businesses. That's all good for our economy, as well as in terms of equality and diversity. So those kinds of things may feature or should feature in your contract as well. So it'll be beyond just the provision of PPE. It'll be, well, where's that coming from? Can we get some of that more local as well? We've also built into the SRA this time, through conversations with colleagues, the consideration of supply chain resilience, and how that might be managed, which kind of is, and in terms of carbon reduction, bringing as much supply back home as we can. The shorter the supply chains, the more control we've got. And the less in terms of emissions that we're generating. So this is just, I'm not expecting you to read this. It's there. This is the page. So I'm just making the point that there's a SRA for goods products and one for services. We haven't currently got one for works, but we're looking into that at the moment. They're ready for you now. They've been fully updated They're there to help you plan your procurement, spot opportunities and risks, to maximise the opportunities and minimise the risks. So they're there for you. They'll shortly be joined by a WPPM, which is kind of an executive summary of how the whole thing works. Because if anyone's seen the SRAs, it's not a good read. It's not a novel. It's a tool. Trying to read it end to end is you go word blind. It's not good. The best way to approach the SRA is with something in mind. With I've got a procurement in mind, and it'll focus your mind on the questions and make things a lot easier to deal with. We've just recently updated them. What we did, because within Welsh Government, and you may find yourselves in your own organisations, statements will be made, strategies will be written, or policies will be drawn up that touch on procurement. And I'm not speaking out of turn, I think, for Welsh Government, because I know this is the case. If anyone wants to argue with me, I'll show you the evidence. We often get written into strategies and documents with actions for procurement without having been referred to. So a couple of years ago, and we've revisited it since, we've spoken to all the policy areas within Welsh Government and said to them, look, where we found them mentioning procurement, we've said, right, you've said procurement can do this for you. How do you see that happening? And we've made them actually face up to the fact that they can't just throw it over the fence and say, away you go, procurement, work that out. We've sat down with him and we've built that learning into the current SRA. So that's how we ended up with talking to colleagues who were concerned about innovation and supply chain resilience, deforestation. So we've made sure that we tried as best we can to reflect within the procurement process and the SRA where we can deal with those risks and opportunities. And we've made the point in a lot of cases that what they're asking us to do is actually something that the organisation needs to do before it ever comes to procurement. So if there's a strategy, there needs to be a commitment to the highest level that, if it's going to cost more, and it doesn't always, certainly doesn't always cost more, then there's got to be a commitment. Yes, that's what we want as an organisation, and that's what we'll deliver. So bringing into the SRA itself, in broad terms, this is the process. So it goes from the general to the specific. So you've got an introduction page that's got statements about wellbeing of future generations and the definitions of sustainable development and sustainable procurement and value for money, just to make it clear what the SRA is about. And then there's an instructions page that basically gives you the step-by-step of how to use the tool itself. But then where the detail comes in, and it is steps 1 to 5. So at step 1, you just setting the context. Step 2, looking at wellbeing of future generations planning, making sure we consider the 5 ways of working. We talk to all the right people, collaborate in all the right ways. Step 3 then is the demand review. So rethink the need. So that is the point at which we have to push back on budget holders who come to us and say, I know where I want it from. Just get it sorted and give me a compliant process. So, I mean, that's buy-in. If you want to do that, that's just buy-in. If you want to do procurement, it's right. Let's have a detailed conversation about opportunities for local supply, potential for exploitation, all the other risks and opportunities that may arise from that. And then step 4 then addresses that life cycle thinking. So it just gets you to break down your product or your service, whatever you're buying, and think about, well, without going into the detail of what you're going to do about it, it's just getting an understanding of what the raw materials are going to be, what the issues in use manufacture are going to be, what the issues in use are going to be, and what the potential issues may be, how you may need to handle the end of life disposal element of it. So it just breaks that down and gets it clear in your head. So steps 1 to 4 are just setting the context. The real meat of it is in step 5, where you start to look at specific issues and some suggestions then on how you're going to deal with that. So as I mentioned, that's the contract header page. It just sets that clearly. Now you may think, well, what's the point of that? But as you get down the road and you start getting into the weeds and the long grass of writing your specifications and doing your raw criteria and deciding what you're going to do, you sometimes need to come back to, right, hang on, what are we doing here? Because if it's a contract or a framework, you're going to have a different approach. The length of the contract, you may be able to keep this in mind as the procurement professionals. If you are, if you're not, and you're perhaps a budget holder or somebody who's getting involved in this because you've got an interest in it, then you may need to be reminded of running away with big ideas about how you're going to change the world, and then hang on a minute, what was the contract value? Oh, okay. You need to limit your ambitions a little bit if you're not spending a whole lot of money, so your influence over the market is going to be significantly less. But we'll try and pick those issues up as we go through. So as I say, I'm not showing the SRA itself, but I'm giving you some screenshots of what we've got in there. So this is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act planning section. So it sets out the 5 ways of working. And yes, the first one's thinking about the long term. So all it asks you to do, it poses that, it says this is what we need to consider from a wellbeing of future generations point of view. So in terms of thinking about the long term, you know, balancing the short term needs, the need to safeguard the ability for those to meet needs in the longer term. And then you've just got a text box. So just stop, think about it. What's this contract going to do? What's this procurement going to do? How are we going to deal with the long term? And it's something we all struggle with. But you know, unless you stop and think about it, we're not going to make the right decisions as we go forward. So it's just dealing with that and documenting your thinking there. In terms of prevention, it's, you know, are we acting to prevent problems occurring or getting worse? So it's saying, you know, within this procurement, your previous experience, these things may have happened, or you've identified an issue. You know, it's just making sure you've got them documented and you've got some rationale for how you're going to move on and deal with that. So I mentioned before, you know, there are 5 ways of working. So you've got the long-term prevention, integration, so making sure you know what you're doing is going to fit in with you know, the organisation's aspirations and what you're trying to do, and integrating with other organisations as well. So that's kind of part of the commercial piece, isn't it? Where you think if you're working with others, if you've got collaborative arrangements, then making sure that everyone's objectives are dealt with and addressed within the specification, and how you then take the procurement forward. Otherwise, they won't be able to use it. The next step then is obviously, you know, the next part of the 5 ways of working is collaboration and involvement. They kind of go together. So I've mentioned collaboration, which kind of flows on from integration, and then involvement. So, you know, considering you know, your end users, who's going to be, you know, accessing the goods or the services, making sure that they feed into it. So you actually, you know, you meet the need, the end user's need, because there's no point coming up with a solution that they choose not to use for whatever reason. And to those 5 ways of working, we've added anticipated benefits. So there's a box that says, as you're setting out to do this procurement, what are you trying to achieve? Not in great detail, but just break it down, the things you're going to try and do, the whole purpose of delivering the contract, what's the primary purpose, any secondary objectives you might have. So social value or things like that may come into that. And then the final bit is just considering how you're going to report outcomes, to make sure you've given some thought to how you're going to perhaps capture and report outcomes as you go forward. So you've got those anticipated benefits. How will you know you've made a difference? What metrics might you be able to have in place to help you with that? And then I mentioned the demand review. So that in the demand review, there are 8 questions. So that's the first 2 questions there. So has the need for this purchase been challenged? Is an opportunity not to buy this at all? So, you know, could you, particularly when you're looking at products, would a servitization model or a service model actually deliver what you want? I mentioned servitization to somebody a few weeks ago, and they weren't familiar with the phrase. It's been around a long time. It's probably not phrased in that way to you, but Rolls-Royce have had a good servitization model since the 60s, apparently. So they make jet engines. Airliners rent the engines essentially. So it's with Rolls-Royce to make sure those engines are fully maintained and as efficient as possible, rather than it being each airline trying to manage that. Schiphol Airport's another good one, where they kind of Philips Electrical, Dutch company. No coincidence that's in Schiphol, Amsterdam Airport, but they provide the lighting levels within the airport. So the airport just says all these spaces need to be lit to a certain level, and it's with Philips then to maintain those light fittings and fixtures. So they get paid against the light levels. So it's in their interest to upgrade and maintain those light fittings, and that apparently works very well. It's an example that's often cited. And then the other questions are: can you rethink the need? There's another way of doing it. Are you buying as little as possible? So if you're going to go ahead, reducing, so that's taking you back to the waste hierarchy. Are you buying as little as possible? Don't get caught by the price break at 1 million items. Yeah, well, great, our money will go further. But if you're going to be left with a big storage problem, there's a cost there. The other way of not doing it, I suppose, is thinking about, and this came out with conversations with colleagues who are concerned about resilience, thinking about a just-in-time model. So is that relevant? Is that appropriate to the way you're doing things? Because it can leave you exposed, as we know, post-COVID now, that a lot of what we were buying was just in time, and then when that supply chain breaks, you haven't got enough stock, and it creates an issue. So that's goes back to assessing what your organisational need is, and then ensuring that you purchase on that basis. The next question then is, any technological advances or innovations, anything has changed? This is kind of that pushback on colleagues who may come to us and say, everything I had for the last 3-4 years has worked fine. I just want to roll that over and carry on. They may be missing opportunities to do things better. The market may will have changed in that time. Improving the efficiency of the purchasing process. So, perhaps collaborate this time. Other commercial considerations there as well. Going down we're all doing e-procurement, but an e-procurement route may be more efficient this time around, and may give you efficiency gains as an organisation. Mentioned collaboration. Can you collaborate to increase your influence over the market? So if you feel you need to make some big changes, you've identified some issues, but you're not going to have enough influence, then aggregating the demand and working with others to and we've just done this. I understand we've done this on electric vehicles, where public sector bodies were struggling to get electric vehicles because of lead-in time, and BT Openreach, all of the supermarkets want their delivery vans to be electric. They're placing orders in the thousands, and we're going to them with the tens. So we've collaborated across the Welsh public sector to consolidate our demand and present a better offer, a juicier proposition to suppliers. It also covers policies and commitments the organisation may need to have. So just to alert yourself to that, document those. Is there anything you need the organisation said you should be doing? Any commitments, particularly to environmental or socio-economic aspects of what you do. So if there's a commitment to fair payment, or a particular commitment to the living wage, then it may be something you need to factor into your procurement as you go forward. And then is your body covered by the Environment Act Wales? So we spoke to biodiversity colleagues, and they wanted it was very important to remind everybody that Act includes a biodiversity duty that basically says, doesn't matter what you're doing, you've got to consider biodiversity in how you do that. We built some of that into step 5 of the questions we ask. And does your organisation have any policies or commitments regarding the Welsh language? So there's Welsh language guidance there on how to approach that, where it's relevant to the contract. So I mentioned the key life cycle impacts. It just looks at raw materials, issues in manufacture, issues in use, and then end of life disposal. And as you can see, all you're doing at this stage is documenting, well, what am I buying? Or will it have plastics in it? Will it have steel, metal in it? All these other issues. You'll notice there are people mentioned in there as well. So at each stage, people are mentioned because there's potential for exploitation within that. So getting into the actual SRA itself. So I'll just take you across the top row for the products SRA. So the first question you've got there is, I'm not expecting you to read it. It says, is the issue to consider relevant to what is going to be procured? So the first question is about, is there an eco-label or an ethical standard product label, supply declaration associated with this product? So considering what you're buying, you just answer that. It just poses that question to you, gives you a little bit of guidance, as you can see there's some of the things you may look at, and I'll look at those in a second. And then what you do there is, in the next column, it says, is the issue relevant? And then you just say yes, no, or unsure. So you just literally say yes, and you move to the next one, or no, and you move to the next one. If you're unsure, you need a plan for, well, where am I going to go and find some information to understand if that's going to be relevant. And the next column then is just very briefly to document. If you're going to go off and speak to colleagues in wherever, just document that. It's a living document. You keep coming back to it till you've resolved that yes or no question. And then what you can do is move across there and think, well, if there is an issue, what's the magnitude? What's the probability? So magnitude being impact. It's different languages in different places, but it's essentially that risk assessment, that impact assessment. So, what's the magnitude if this issue isn't grasped? Is it going to be a big issue or a small issue? If it's an issue, what's the likelihood of it happening? So probability, likelihood, what's the chance of it actually coming about? And then you score those as high, medium or low, and it will change the significant risk score automatically. So it'll be, for that one, low is green. You get combinations of medium, low, medium, high. You may have low and high, but it'll give you a risk score and it will color code that, and I'll show you how that works for you as we move through. So I mentioned eco labels, just to give you reassurance that there's a lot of stuff out there you can use. The procurement officer's friend here. If you can specify a standard, and all these standards are general across industry now, you won't be asking for something that only a small number of suppliers can meet for you. So FSC is in there, EPEAT for IT equipment. We've got the energy ratings, just mentioned that because they recently recalibrated. I don't know if you were familiar before, but we ended up with A star. So they've recalibrated all of that. And just to give you a reassurance, what is currently energy rated D used to be energy rated A. So that's how much the world had moved on. So they've been able to recalibrate in those ways. In terms of plastics, you can see the green triangles there, plastic recycling symbols. So, products need to be stamped, to be recognised, the component parts, so they can go back off and into the right waste streams. So just as I say, it's just there to give you a bit of reassurance that there are things you can latch on to. Those standards will be written for you. There may well be clauses that come with them as well, so you can just drop them into your contract. If there's elements of it that you like but you don't want to use all of it, or you think the market wouldn't stand you going full bore on it, then you can just cut and paste out the elements of the standard that you want them to live up to. So you can use them in a number of ways. And the PCRs, I know they're changing, but the PCRs regulation 43 talks about labels and looks at that. So the next step, having considered the issue, yes, it matters, you've scored it. So if you said yes, you need then obviously to do something about it. So the next stage, and this is moving to the right across that, across the top line, you come then to the section that's about mitigating actions. So this is where we put all the work in, spoke to policy colleagues in other areas. So what we've said to them is, look, we need some minimum actions here to give people a start. It's not exhaustive, it's just some suggestions. But if you've identified something as an issue, you'll need to think, well, now what do I do about that? And that's all that does. It gives you a breakdown of some of the actions you can take. The next step then is you've decided what the actions you need to take. Where's the most appropriate place within the procurement cycle that you would need to build that in. So obviously, if you can get in the specification, you've drawn a line. If suppliers can't meet that, they don't get to bid. So the specification is really powerful. But you may be in situations where the market's a bit restricted. So you may think, well, I won't put it in the specification, or I'll put it in a light touch way in the specification, but I'll look at supplier selection. I'll ask some questions of suppliers to make sure that they've got the right standards and that we're drawing in the right supplier for the job. So I always refer to it as a cultural fit in terms of supplier selection. You're trying to find somebody who's willing to work with you, and we'll talk about this next week on the carbon reduction plan stuff. It's all about finding somebody who understands what you're after and is working with you on that, and they're not wanting to go off and do their own thing and do something different. It says evaluation there, but it's award criteria, what goes into your tender. How are you going to evaluate? What do you want to put into the tender? How are you going to score it? So you can put your thoughts in there. And then anything that may be needed to pass over for contract management, or if it's an issue that can't really be dealt with at those other stages, you're going to have to let the contract. You can pick it up. We've suggested in the decarbonisation guidance. If you've got an innovation clause or a variation clause, that's what you use. You say, right, the innovation clause, what this is going to be about is this issue. You've now won the contract. I want to work. You need to work with me on your packaging or your distribution or your supply chain or whatever it might be. And then the final point then is to, if you possibly can, and it's really important to do this, is try and put a KPI on that. So you've identified an issue, you're going to do something about it. You need to be able to demonstrate that things have changed. You'll notice that there are these little red triangles in the top of a lot of the boxes. So because this is a spreadsheet version, it allows us to put some additional guidance in there. So if you hover over supply selection, you get a little bit of a note on, well, what does that mean and why is it important? And then just as a quick way of, I've used this, I've done it in this way. So you've run through, you've answered all the questions. The best way to do that before you start looking at the minimum specification, the rest of it, I would, because it's a spreadsheet, so I use it, reduce it down, look where all the red ones are, and work out how many you've got. And typically you're not going to find, very rarely you get more than maybe 4 or 5. So you'll answer all the questions. 4 or 5 of them will come out as really high impact or really important to be dealt with in your contract. The amber ones, then you'd go to, if you've got if resource allows you, you would be it'd be good to address those. And even some of the ones that are coming out as a low impact, you may still choose to or decide that it's worthwhile doing something with those. But in terms of the red, that's a high risk or a high opportunity, big opportunity to do something bigger and better. In terms of supply market, just to try and give you a bit of reassurance, there are some things out there that could be useful. I don't know if anybody's seen the Fleet Operators Registration Scheme. You've probably seen the badges on the back of lorries. That comes in gold, silver and bronze. It was developed by Transport for Wales. But in order to get that accreditation and maintain it, operators have got to operate fleets that are achieving exemplary levels of safety, efficiency and environmental protection, so that they'll be clean vehicles. Anybody who's familiar with or been familiar before with the EU Protected Geographical Indicator, the PGI status, that badge is gone now. We're no longer in the EU, but the UK government have developed 3. So you've got geographic origin, traditional speciality and designated origin badges as well. So we've got 3 so far in Wales. I don't know what it says to us, they're all about food, but there you go. Salt marsh lamb, Cambrian mountain lamb and Welsh leeks have been identified as the national emblem and can achieve that badge. Just where we've got 10 minutes to go, so I won't go through all of these, but just highlighting a few things that are out there, things I've come across over time. Notice innocent smoothies are now, each of the packs, a lot of their packs have got a carbon footprint, so a carbon assessment for the carbon in the production of that product, and that's going to move others in the market who are going to want to demonstrate the credentials in that area. The other one that was very interesting and has been around for a long time now is in terms of toilet rolls. We buy a lot of these things. A lot of the manufacturers now are using smaller cardboard inserts and getting, as you can see there with the Tesco example, 24 rolls go on 24 rolls go on 12 cardboard tubes. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, it's more product in a smaller space. So it means that in terms of lorries on the road, that's reducing the amount of time, the amount of vehicle space that's needed. So that's going to reduce time on the road, and that's all the emissions and everything else that come with that. Some other good stuff, see the oat milk there, so plant-based and all these other options are out there, and lots of people, I won't go into the detail there because of time, but you'll notice that in all of those cases, or in most of those cases, there's some reference, some nod to CO2, because everybody knows, all suppliers know that this is something we're concerned about as individuals and as particularly when it comes to us as businesses. So they want to demonstrate their credentials and they're doing the right thing. So this was just one I came across, and it was interesting. Some claims in here that look great, 89%. Well, that's great. But when you actually turn it over and look at the back, you start realising, that there may be some issues with this. And I mentioned this because when it comes to procurement, if you get claims by suppliers, they do need to be backed up with something solid. So, they're claiming a 36% carbon reduction there. There's a 3 asterisks and it says CO2 impact. Nowhere on the packaging does it say what those 3 asterisks refer to. I'm presuming there's a company called CO2 Impact. They've accredited that reduction in carbon. Reduction against what? What does that actually mean? In real terms, yes, great that they're using recycled plastic and ocean plastics, but when you look into the detail of that, they're using, it's 2.5% of the hard plastics is ocean plastic, which is a really laudable thing to do. I'm not decrying that at all, but in terms of if you're trying to differentiate that between this product with another supplier's product, then you've got a bit of an issue there, haven't you? And then just this one that just made me laugh really. This had this bag from somewhere. I'm made from up to 60% recycled materials. So okay, anything from 1 to 59%, is that? So you want, I am made from 60% recycled materials is what you'd want to see. You'd actually want to see 100%, because a lot of plastic bags, and I checked after I saw that, all the Tesco's bags, the Asda bags all say, bag for life, I'm made from 100% recycled material. I'm reusable. No great claim there really. It's a bag. And recyclable. Yeah, it's recyclable. I showed you the triangles before. There's nothing on there that tells me what plastic that is. So in terms of recyclability, it's going to be, it moves down the hierarchy, it becomes less and less useful. It has to be, it can't go into waste streams with other plastics of specific types. So that becomes a bit of an issue. As I mentioned, we've got the WPPN, so that'll be launched this week. So that's the guidance that explains what the SRA is and gives you some of the detail I've talked about today. And there's a policy mapping tool coming in September, October. So that is going to basically build the SRA into an online version. Paul's going to jump in now. Paul, go on. Something coming tomorrow people may be interested in.
It's coming today, I think, Brendan. I've
just posted today.
I posted in the chat bar 2 p.m. today, keyed as part of the community development approach that they champion, are running a workshop on the policy mapping tool. So it's not the finished article, but it's an opportunity for us as a community to come together to basically workshop the current approach and help shape that particular tool so it will truly meet our needs in September and October.
Yeah, and what I would say is, I mean, I've worked on the development of that. It's going to be a lot more user-friendly than what if anybody's used the SRA, if anyone wants to see it after this, we can do that. But if anyone's seen it, the current SRA, it is useful. I use it a lot. I created it. I find it really difficult sometimes to navigate through. So somebody new to it is going to have an issue. And we've tried for many years to get an online version. So I'm glad to say we're there now. And it's going to work really simply and really well for you. It's much clearer. All the guidance is still in there, but you only get presented with the bits that are relevant. Once you've said yes to something, or if you've said no to something, you don't get presented with any further information on that. It doesn't get in your way, which is really useful. So I've only left 6 minutes for questions, but anything in the chat, Paul? Or
nothing's in the chat as yet. Just to say, I've posted links to the SRA earlier on as well, so they're available for you. Just a couple of things for me before we throw it open to the wider audience. I've used the SRA throughout the years. I've never stopped using it. It's a wonderful tool, and I think the new iteration, you did say it's it's a large scale document there, Brendan, but it just takes you on that procurement journey as you described from start to finish. And the way that it links to the wellbeing of future generations, the 5 ways of working, that's really important. The commissioner is all over our activity and wanting to know how we support the 7 goals and how we're working to the 5 ways of working. So all of that there is captured, and it really does help you develop that particular model. It's a really powerful document, but I think in the past, Brendan, we were always saying it should be used for all activity above £25,000, and they're just a general feel. It's really good for perhaps a larger scale activity above the founder tender service threshold, where you're bringing teams together across an organization. That's the real value of it, when your team sort of assessing an activity and you use the SRA to take everybody through that particular activity. So I don't know what the new policy note's going to say about its potential use and application. I know, Brendan, you say it should be used for everything above 25k, but
no, I mean that's the commitment the Welsh Government made, and they do use it.
Yeah.
CPS, Corporate Procurement Services, anybody coming to them, anything over 25, but it'd be a 25,000, up to the procurement thresholds. It'd be a fairly quick run through. You'd be identifying 1 or 2 key things that may be relevant. It's going to be a fairly small requirement anyway, so it's not going to be extensive in terms of the things you can do. Yeah, the WPPN does say, obviously the further up, the higher the value, you'd have a project team. So the project team should own the SRA and work on it together as a group, and come up, make the decisions about how it's going to go forward. But people use it as they see fit, and within the resource that you have available and the time you have available. So if you're prioritizing your procurement, if you're doing your spend profile and you understand where your biggest impact is as an organization, apply it to those. If you did a Pareto, pick out your top 20% contracts that are covering 80% of your value, apply it to that. And the long tail of lower value stuff, you can deal with it in slightly different ways, but the SRA will help you with that, just to pick up some specific issues.
Excellent, thanks, Brendan. And you mentioned at the outset the new legislation around the Social Partnerships and Procurement Bill. And of course, there's quite a focus there on major services, which you could use the SRA to help inform your approach, most certainly, but also around construction. So are you aware of any plans for the development of a construction sustainable risk assessment tool? It's always something I've felt would be really, really useful, but I don't know if you've got an update on that.
Yeah, with the company that are building the online SRA tool, they've said, well, the architecture, what basically they're going to have, there's a products journey and a services journey through that. So depending, you start off with what are you buying, goods or services. If you're goods, you go down one set of questions. If it's services, you go down another set. And what they're going to do, they're going to build a similar structure for works, and then we'll populate that over time to make sure that we can build that up. So
Brilliant.
in terms of, we're going to have the architecture, the content won't be there in autumn, but it's going to give us the facility to build it. We're not going to have to start from scratch and do something different, and it'll all sit in the same place.
Excellent. So that's something that's going to be coming, and they'll be really supportive for all of us involved in construction type procurement activity. So excellent. I've monopolised the questions to date. We've got a few more minutes left. So is there anything else from across the floor? And we'd be happy to just, people want to pop their hand up, or equally if they just want to pop a question in the chat bar.
And there's the option, after the call ends, you can still get into the chat, can't you, and post a question there, or probably useful. And I think people will have my email anyway, but it's there, and the slide set will be shared. So if anybody's got any specific questions or any follow-up they want to do, or if you want to see the SRA, run through it as it is, then we can do that with you as well.
Yeah, great stuff. Right, well, it's 12:59 now. We've not had any questions, so just a very big thank you, Brendan, for taking us through the wider sustainability there, of course, and then focusing in on the Sustainable Risk Assessment tool. As I've said, as you can probably tell, I am a champion of it. We use it extensively, and it is a really valuable tool, particularly where you're working with a number of different stakeholders. And it, as Brendan described, it covers a lot more there. There's quite a bit of the commercialization, which of course is all part of the same picture, isn't it? So a big thank you, Brendan. We've got some exciting next steps coming up, of course. We've got the policy mapping tool, and you can find out more about that at 2 p.m. With Keith this afternoon. And if you can't make this afternoon, that session and this session, they're both going to be recorded, and they'll be available on the Keed website. So you'll be able to get hold of that particular resource. The SRA is live now on the Welsh Government website, and everybody's had an offer there if they want to know a little bit more, or probably if you want to know more about it, yeah, please do contact Brendan. But also, if you can copy in our colleagues, Denise and Joe, then it might be we look at arranging another session for certain key stakeholders with a little bit more detailed focus depending on the requests as they come in. And finally, of course, on mentioning Denise and Joe, a big thank you for all of their efforts in organising today's event. So it's 1 o'clock. It's been brilliantly chaired, he modestly remarked. No, thanks to Brendan, we finished on time, and thank you to everybody for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan.
Thanks all. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan.